You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin our program today in Singapore, where the leaders of the 10-member Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, will gather from Wednesday to Saturday for the bloc's 32nd summit. The combined economies of ASEAN are the world's 6th largest market. Heads of the ASEAN states will discuss regional and international issues during the summit. Take a look at this.
The 32nd ASEAN Summit. This bloc covers a region of 650 million people, including major economies like Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Singapore succeeded the Philippines as this year's rotating chairman. The theme of this summit is Resilient and Innovative ASEAN.
We are now quite well placed in terms of our ability to go digital. The other thing that is important is that Southeast Asia is full of natural resources. In recent years, people are moving away from just oil and gas and the coal that we have in abundance. We are now looking into things that we can do well, for example, producing food.
ASEAN celebrated its 50th anniversary last year. In a recent ASEAN finance ministers meeting, Singapore's finance minister said the bloc was estimated to have grown by an impressive 5.1% in 2017 and is expected to outpace most other regions this year. The bloc has played a significant role in Asia-Pacific over the years, but recent trade tensions between the U.S. and China have led to a mix of fear and hope across Southeast Asia.
I think in the medium to long term, this sort of wake-up call, if you like, is good because it compels very significant structural shifts in the economic planning and activities of states, in particular here in ASEAN.
Faced with trade disputes, ASEAN has focused on speeding up its own economic integration, and the bloc is also engaged in making the regional body a global player.
Three-day summit. Can the ASEAN Summit deliver any groundbreaking results this year? With us to discuss that, we have quite a strong panel from China. We have Song Qingren, Associate Professor from the Institute of South and Southeast Asian and Ocean Studies of the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. In Singapore, we have Lin Tan-Wai, Adjunct Research Fellow at the National University of Singapore. In Thailand, in Bangkok, we are joined by Shang Buprakong, former advisor to the Thai government. And finally, in Washington, Anthony Nelson, Director of East Asia and Pacific Practice at Albright Stonebridge Group. I want to welcome to the four of you gentlemen, starting from Mr. Lim. This year, Singapore is hosting the summit while being the rotating chair of ASEAN. How much do you think, from a scholar's perspective, that countries and economies in the region will be able to reach a deal, particularly about a common consensus about where the international trade is going, given the ever-rising protectionism and the gestures recently from the United States?
I think on the top of the agenda, ASEAN countries in Singapore are going to discuss integration of smart cities across the region. Singapore is an example of a smart city. We try to use digital technologies for infrastructure and also use digital technologies to track the environment, and also to have research and development in cutting-edge technologies. All these are the makings of a smart city to attract talents to the city. And so Singapore doesn't want to be the only smart city within ASEAN, but to connect and integrate with other smart cities within ASEAN. And I think this is gaining a lot of traction as the main agenda in the ASEAN Summit.
So, Mr. Lim, if I understand right, that the ASEAN economies, despite of the fact that they are at the lower and the middle level of the global supply chain, is going to hide away from the real hot topic of the world, which is where is the trade going to go internationally, particularly given the recent trade disputes and tensions going on between some of the major economies. Some of those are really right there in the Asia-Pacific region. You are saying ASEAN this year is not going to focus any attention on those important issues. Then people would wonder, what is the legitimacy of ASEAN when it comes to discussing real important issues of the region, Mr. Lim?
I think ASEAN has a tradition of supporting free trade, and it is also a beneficiary of free trade and open trade, as with most East Asian economies. And many countries feel that it does not benefit anyone when there are trade frictions. And ASEAN has been a friend and trading partner of many major trading economies in the region. And that includes all the major powers like US, China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, etc. So I think ASEAN wants to be able to work with all partners and to ensure that the infrastructure and also the environment is good for open and free trade.
Okay. Mr. Bukrakong, coming from Thailand, also an important member of ASEAN. Will ASEAN Summit this time be put under spotlight because of the regional and international trade issues? People would watch very closely as to what kind of consensus, what kind of statement, or what kind of agreement that the ASEAN economy this time would come out regarding trade. To what extent do you think the ASEAN economies are willing to express in this regard?
Well, we have 5 issues that have to be discussed in Singapore. Trade friction with the United States and China, which will affect our region a great deal. I think that most people don't realize that China is actually ASEAN, our biggest trader, even ahead of the United States. There's this type of conflict in the long term will affect us somewhat. We really don't know how much. But as far as other issues, because we are ASEAN, we believe in consensus, and it has stabilized the organization. We have solved larger issues, but issues that come up at hand, whether it's a Rohingya or whether it's external factor with China-United States trade, we have benefit from being China's neighbors. You know, our trade were upward almost 14% last year, and because of proximity, we believe that this trend would continue despite of some trade conflict, but we don't know the proportion. How will it work? Would United States export to U.S. affect greatly? But I think that China, to a certain extent, will benefit from this conflict with ASEAN far more than United States, but we have to wait and see.
Well, a lot of things are fluid. That's why people come out with different attitudes and statements about what they support. It's not about picking the lines or the team where you want to join, but rather the basic principles that people want to hold on to when it comes to trade. Let me go to you, Mr. Song, here in Beijing. I'm not asking you to force your ASEAN friends to be standing in one team or the other, but rather I'm asking you from a scholar's perspective, how do you see the current realities, China and ASEAN trade? How big is the market for ASEAN countries when it comes to China? And what is going to be the ASEAN's role when it comes to China's future plan of international trade? Because now China is having this ever-diversified purchasing plan all over the world. Meanwhile, Mr. Song, China is also thinking about how to diversify the sources of international trade. For example, how to diversify what is already doing with the United States for the future. Mr. Song, what do you think?
Yeah, China is the biggest neighbor of ASEAN, and also China is the biggest trade partner for ASEAN, almost, I think, 80 years. So I just checked the figures about last year. China-ASEAN, the total trade according to China's statistics is more than $500 billion, and the growth rate is nearly 14%. This year, the first quarter, I think China-ASEAN trade is about $130 billion, and its growth is also robust, nearly 20%.
Okay,
so,
a lot of numbers.
Yeah, yeah.
For us, who is not a math major, what are you trying to say, sir?
Yeah. So, and also I think so in the future, both China and ASEAN economic growth grows robustly. So I think in the future, the total trade volume this year and also in the next following years will become bigger.
Besides the numbers, there are a lot of things going on when it comes to trade. For example, earlier we have a lot of programs devoted to the discussion of two proposed trade blocs or trade deals, trade platforms, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, and the RCEP, the regional, that stands for R, which is the regional one. So have already courted the ASEAN nations for some time. 4 ASEAN nations have already signed the unratified TPP, while many others in the region have announced interest in joining. Meanwhile, the ASEAN nations are expected to sign the RCEP or RCEP agreement at November ASEAN Summit, along with 6 other neighbors, namely China, Japan, Korea, South Korea mainly, Australia, New Zealand, and India. RCEP, RCEP has gained more traction after the U.S. left the TPP. Of course, Mr. Nelson, you have been very tentatively listening to your colleagues coming from Asia. From Washington's perspective, of course now, TPP is still out of the question, even though Japan and Australia talk about they are there in order to proceed with future preparations. How does the United States see the bloc of ASEAN when it comes to trade? And when trading policies and principles fundamentally change from the U.S. side, has Washington been thinking about the impact on their trading partners, even in Southeast Asia?
Well, ASEAN is an incredibly important market to the United States. It's the 4th largest export market for the U.S., the 5th largest trading partner. And if you look at investment, U.S. companies have about $274 billion invested in ASEAN, which is more than what they have in China, India, and Japan combined. The TPP was never meant to engage all of ASEAN, but it was meant to provide a kind of aspirational agreement that might signal the kind of trade agreements that the U.S. would like to work towards with other ASEAN countries. The Trump administration has been less interested in engaging multilaterally and much more focused on its bilateral relationships. In particular in ASEAN, they're concerned with trade deficits. The U.S. does trade a lot with ASEAN, but we see 4 of the largest trade deficits that the U.S. has with ASEAN countries. That's a really key bilateral priority for the Trump administration, and where they want discussions to go around. They want to encourage more purchases of U.S. goods. They want to encourage more market access. They're going to try to do that bilaterally if they can. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which does bring together about 50% of the world's population, isn't a high standards deal like the TPP was, but what it does do is provide a floor of commitment and put a little bit of force behind some of the ASEAN Economic Community commitments. Because as you know, ASEAN doesn't really have an enforcement mechanism to some of its commitments in economic integration.
Right.
So RCEP can kind of help add that and help complete the commitments that have already been agreed to.
Talking about whether Mr. Nelson, when he suggested that the United States want to quote-unquote correct the trade deficit with 4 of the countries in Southeast Asia, Mr. Bupakong, as well as Mr. Lim from Singapore, do you think the ASEAN countries will be able to do that? By the way, the reason why these countries come together is because they believe their economy, their size is relatively small, and therefore their bargaining power is relatively weak. However, when they come together, there's likely to be a bigger momentum for all the economies, even though they're at different development stages. So I want to invite the opinions of the other 2 gentlemen coming from ASEAN countries. Mr. Bupakong, your view.
I believe that unless the Trump administration telegraph its intention a little bit more clear whether they want to pursue more bilateral, so Thailand could adjust. At this point, the current Thai government want to have a little bit of a clearer stance, but we prefer that we are considering joining the TPP already, so far. We want to stay within this mode. And in a way, President Trump seems to want to get back, but there are sort of a discussion within this administration, and we are waiting for that clarity stance. We welcome more trade. We have trade with the United States for almost 200 years, and will be our major partner. So as far as Thailand concerned, we welcome any type of negotiation with the U.S. so we could continue this benefit for both of our country.
It seems that, Mr. Lim, two things are in a way mind-boggling. One is what exactly is the approach that the U.S. want to have with the ASEAN countries, whether bilateral or multilateral. And secondly, whether some of the earlier proposed multilateral platforms, which has been denied by the Trump administration, then later picked up again about the interest, and then never really firmly expressed of coming or entering into, could become a big issue for ASEAN countries. From your perspective, particularly Singapore, service sector, extremely important. Your investment sector, all over the world, including in Asia, very important. How do you see that?
There are many initiatives in the service sector. Take the educational qualification, for example. There is a lot of consensus that eventually ASEAN countries is able to cross-recognize each other's educational qualifications, and this will help mobility of people, of talents, and of workers and expertise across the ASEAN country. And in December 2015, ASEAN countries have signed as ASEAN Economic Community, and all these signs point towards an intention for greater integration. And as a region, they welcome all forms of arrangement that promotes free trade. For example, both RCEP and CP, TPP or TPP. Countries like Singapore, for example, are in favor of both of them because they help to promote free trade. And so as a beneficiary of free trade for the past few decades, you can see that all these directions point towards the desire to have a greater free trade and to have greater mobility of talents. And in the most recent summit today, they're also going to talk about connectivity between smart cities. So all these are kind of consensus and discussion points for ASEAN countries.
Talking about the trade platform, there's also something called the RCEP that is actually being discussed among economies there. It is likely, according to some, that the principles of the RCEP basic document could come out later in the year. But Mr. Song, I don't know how mature is that suggestion about later this year, and what does it mean for ASEAN as a region, and also ASEAN's partnership with China and some of the other major economies?
Yeah. According to some sources, the ASEAN and some of its partners, 6 partners, wants to finish the negotiation at the end of this year. I think when the RCEP or RCEP is established, a very big trading bloc, I think nearly 40% of the total population of the whole world, or even half of the percent of the total population of the world, the big market, I think the regional economy now is robust. I think as the Philippine President Mr. Duterte said, Asia now is the engine of the world economy. So I think if Asia and its partners' economy grows robust in the following years, the world economy will be stable and grows well.
All right. Mr. Nelson, we heard about the speeches given by Mr. Duterte and also Mr. Lee Hsien Loong coming from Singapore and the Philippines separately during the recently concluded Boao Forum. They talk about the growth engine of the world being Asia. But, of course, that is exclude the factor that there will be disturbing tensions and conflicts in the region. Mr. Nelson, how how do you think, when the Trump administration coming into the second year and the midterm election as well, and looking up to the next 2 years, that kinds of plan should be mapped out regarding its relationship with Asia, particularly on trade?
Yeah, I think it ought to be an incredibly important priority for the Trump administration. The Obama administration really made engaging with ASEAN an enormous priority in a way that was pretty unprecedented. And the Trump administration has certainly had that high-level engagement. Vice President Pence came to Indonesia and visited the ASEAN Secretariat. President Trump attended the East Asia Summit. But it hasn't been backed up by a sustained strategy for what the U.S. wants its relationship with ASEAN to look like. Without the TPP, there isn't that kind of guide star for what the economic relationship should be. And these transactional bilateral approaches looking at trade deficits and individual issues that come up don't really provide a long-term strategy. So it's important for the Trump administration, as a new Secretary of State comes in, and hopefully that'll bring along with it ambassadors to ASEAN, ambassadors to some of these key capitals, and a more sustained and clear engagement with the region.
I see. We only have less than 1 minute left. May I invite 20 or 15 seconds from every one of you, the other three gentlemen in the region. Belt and Road is an initiative put forward. Many of you are coming from countries that have signed up to it. So what is going to be the solution it could provide, or alternative it could provide? Mr. Lim, very briefly, 15 seconds if you can, sir.
The BRI is a project in connectivity, and the latest developments are seen in Laos and also in Thailand. So it will be a long-term project that will involve many ASEAN countries.
All right.
And connectivity is important to ASEAN.
Okay, Mr. Pak, 15 seconds, sir.
I foresee some connectivity that has taken place last week. In fact, Mr. Ma has come in and invest and make it Alibaba with Thai government. So that platform should facilitate increased number of trade between the region.
All right. And Mr. Song, very briefly, 10 seconds if you can, sir.
Yeah. And China, ASEAN, and also other countries, when we built the Belt and Road, so we will promote the mutual investment and to promote the trade and also to promote the connectivity.
Okay.
So we will boost our economy.
All right. For now, I want to thank the four of you for being with us, because this is a fascinating issue, the issue of trade. Where is it going? Here in ASEAN countries and beyond. Thank you so much, Song Qinglin, Lin Tianwai, Pak, and Anthony Nelson. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us.